Cerebro has a message from the professor. Jubilee?
Greetings, X-Men.
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. Joining me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City, and now somewhere up in upstate New York. She's Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hello, Brian.
Welcome to another peek at X-Men. This is like episode 8 or something, right?
Yes.
And things are really ramping up.
Well, I have to confess that because we're also watching X-Men 97, and that is also, we're around episode 7, episode 8, my brain is starting to merge the stories together. I know there's other people doing this right now because the new show is on Disney Plus.
Yeah.
And so they're watching the original X-Men animated series either as they're watching X-Men 97 or like before they catch up on X-Men 97. So I'm not alone in having both series kind of working in my brain.
Yeah.
But now I'm starting to get some of the stories a little bit like they're weaving into one another. They're intersecting, which is actually what comics do a lot. So I'm just going to go with it.
There was one moment as we were watching the episode today where I got confused because of X-Men 97. And that's
okay. So it's not just me.
Well, it was just for the splittest of seconds. But there was a moment where Rogue is talking about Colossus as being like a hunk and, you know, tall, dark, and Russian, and, you know, just clearly like, kind of into him.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking in my head about a major thing that just happened in 97 that we can't talk about for people who don't want to be spoiled. But I'm like, really?
She moves kind of fast.
Come on, man. What are you thinking of X-Men 97?
I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah.
Every episode is so jam-packed with action and
story. That's the thing.
Yes.
That's the thing is for as much action as there is so much story happening in every single episode of that new show.
It reminded me of why I loved reading comics in the 90s, actually. They are soap operas.
Yeah.
There's romance, there's love triangles, there's loss, there's traumatic grief, there's surprises at, you know, the end of every comic book. It's
the surprise is usually whoever you just lost, not actually gone.
Don't say that.
They might be evil
know.
now, but only for a short period of time, you know, about 5 issues or so, and then they'll come back. But
comics for me, it was like watching soap operas, but for comic book characters. And at the time in my life, like as a teenager, as an adolescent going into teenagehood, and then as a teenager, it was riveting. Yeah. And so I'm kind of having that nostalgic feeling watching X-Men 97 with a different relationship stories and the fallout and the reunions, and there's a ton of trauma as well. The last couple of episodes have been so psychologically rich. Mm-hmm. And for those listeners who are watching X-Men 97, they'll know that there is one episode 5, and I think also episode 7 have this turning point. Mm-hmm. It's a big event happens, and then it's the aftermath, and we see all of the characters responding and reacting in different ways to their traumatic grief, and it's just very illuminating. It's very emotional, and it's also very adult just in terms of how it's written.
Yeah.
So I hearken back to what Eric Lewald said on our WonderCon panel about being given the opportunity as a showrunner to make this an adult show or an adult level writing.
Yeah, he and Julia talked about Margaret Lesh, who was in charge of Fox Kids at the time, and her mandate was don't write down to children. Treat this as if it were an hour-long live action show for adults, and the kids will learn everything they need and will follow. And for the most part, I think she was right. Although we have seen recently that kids who grew up on the original X-Men, the animated series, or the comics didn't necessarily take the morals of each story to heart. They started attacking people online.
Wait, what?
Oh yeah, you haven't seen. In fact, during our panel, one of the people who asked a question, it wasn't so much a question; it was a word to Julia about how she responded to people online accusing X-Men 97 of being woke.
I see. Okay,
and she's like, these people didn't learn the lessons we were trying to teach in 1992. You know, like you weren't paying attention.
Well,
these are people who only liked it because it was a cool action adventure show. These are people who are, and it's unfair to put this on the character of Wolverine.
Okay.
But Wolverine is so misunderstood within the context of comic book fans because people like to liken him to the Punisher or someone like that. Just a badass who's got claws,
just like
and who's
ripping it
willing
up
to just kill you for no good reason. Meanwhile, most good writers will figure out ways to inject some of the most humanity of any of the characters into Logan.
Mm-hmm. And you see it in the animated series, how caring he is in his own way, especially for these younger up and coming mutants who are figuring out the world and how they're placed in the world.
Yeah.
And with his wisdom being what you said before, maybe in his 90s,
but in this particular incarnation of the series, we know that he's at least 92, 93.
He's like
because,
born at the turn of the century.
Because he was born, in
so
1900.
he uses his emotional intelligence and his emotional wisdom to help others in a way that's one of his mutant powers is that insight.
Mm-hmm. But people online just want to latch on to the cool Wolverine character. And I think that's unfair. I think it's an example of people not fully paying attention to the text and to the subtext of the stories.
I agree with what you're saying, and now I'm realizing what you mean by this, that there are people who are watching X-Men 97 are fine. I think there's also a lot of people who are not watching X-Men 97, but seeing screenshots or seeing clips and finding out about it and then going online and complaining, because a lot of those claims are really aren't seen, like really aren't actualized in the show if they're really paying attention. But you're right. There are a bunch of haters who are claiming that the show is performative, and
it's not just X-Men. Like Star Trek has gotten the same flack over the last couple of years for being too woke, and you're like, dude, did you watch the 60s TV series?
Same for Star Wars, but I see your point in that X-Men comics have, despite some of the original characters not necessarily being directly created for imagining or reimagining social justice work and the social justice movement, it became that. Yeah. And it has been that for decades. So it is I have just this bewilderment around people who attack X-Men specifically for having an agenda around equality and social justice when
you're literally talking about a war between humankinds and mutants just wanting to be equal and share the same space.
There's words like, slaves and internment camps and the inhibition collars and all these just very direct references to oppressive societies. And and I know we've talked about this before, what I appreciate about X-Men is that you can then kind of have different interpretations and different messages and activate different parts of your own ideology through the narrative. It doesn't necessarily force a specific narrative about social justice down your throat, but it does raise consciousness around what this experience must be like for this group of a part of society that is seen as subhuman.
Right.
And we're learning so many lessons from that. So I think you're right. There are these wild claims, and if anyone is watching, I know our show isn't specifically about X-Men 97, but but if anyone is watching X-Men 97, I almost want to say there are subtle, and then there are more direct references to events that are happening in our own current socio-political landscape.
And that's what I was curious about going in, because the last series ended in 1996, and so much has happened since then that is so incredibly different when you look at the world now versus then. It's astronomical how different it is. But economically, politically, etc. And I was really curious about how this show would pick up after that. And as far as I'm concerned, it seems pretty seamless. They have managed to seamlessly and almost effortlessly, and I use that term loosely because I realize just how much work must have gone into writing and producing this show, but it seems to an audience member so seamless and so effortless to inject today's world into a show that takes place in 1997.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And my reaction to that is our interpretation or our receiving of those messages feels a little bit like attention is brought to how much has changed and how much has not changed. Mm-hmm. So for instance, I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, it works seamlessly. And in some ways, I'm not that surprised because many of these bigger issues have remained unresolved or unreconciled.
For as long as the X-Men have been around, and now we're putting a spotlight on them. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there are so many things that have been unresolved since 96 and even before that becomes evergreen. We can always cover this sort of material. Mm-hmm. But yeah, when I just think of a post 9/11 world trying to write a show that ostensibly takes place pre 9/11.
Yes, and yet, again, without giving away too much about X-Men 97, they've even built in a 9/11 type event. Yeah. So they can have their post 9/11 moments and recoveries and processing and consciousness. They're doing it so well. Enough of us just praising X-Men 97. This is a big commercial just to say, go watch it.
Yeah, but Disney Plus is not paying us to talk about this extensively. No. However, we have made a couple of new friends from X-Men 97, specifically J.B. Ballard, who was a writer on the show, just wrote episode 7 that we just saw. It just dropped this week. Doozy of an episode. And he was on our panel at WonderCon, which you referenced. So was Eric and Julia Leewald. So was our friend David Nett. Talk about WonderCon in general, because you weren't part of the intro for the last episode where we played our panel. If you haven't heard that episode, that is our panel from WonderCon. We talked about, we examined the X-Men. Talk about WonderCon. What was your experience like?
Our panels are usually just under an hour. maybe even longer if they give us a little bit of time.
Sure.
But it's a tight hour. And we covered so much in that conversation about the process and the genius of translating 90s style comic books into an animated series. And it was really enlightening to hear the showrunners especially talk about the directions they were given, some of the limitations, but overall, as far as the character development, as far as how they could take the nuances and the characteristics of the X-Men, they actually had a lot of places to go, and they really ran with that. And J.B. Ballard, who writes on X-Men 97, had said the original show became a blueprint for then how they were going to handle the drama and then the stories of the new show.
Yeah.
And that technique seems to work because so much of X-Men 97 is recognizable. It's familiar as X-Men animated storytelling, but also feels current, feels modern, feels like it's telling us a story that's relevant today. And as you said, Brian, it is contextualized in the world of 1997, and that navigation of story and familiarity and relevance is an interesting dance, but they're doing it really, really well.
I think so. Let's talk about this episode, Drea. There's a couple of new characters introduced in this episode. If you remember, after the Genosha episode, everyone was rescued. Remy, Jubilee, Storm were all rescued from Genosha and were brought back home to find a X-Manor in rubble. And the question was Remy still the traitor we thought he could be? Interestingly, they don't touch on that in this episode. There was no, because you remember the last thing that Remy, aka Gambit, said to Jubilee was basically alluding to, "Are you so sure I'm not still a bad guy?" And then we see the school in ruins, and you're like, "Oh, maybe he is." By the way, if you're on Patreon,
what is going on?
If you're on
with your
Patreon
hair?
and you've got the video version of the podcast, my hair is amazing right now. I just keep looking down at my monitor for notes, and I keep seeing the mop. But yeah, they don't touch on that at all. There is no question. In fact, Remy isn't even really a part of this particular episode.
No, he's not. I think they may still, I think we're meant to still question his allegiance, but he's not in this episode.
Yeah. Who is in this episode? Two new characters. They go looking for someone who could destroy the manor in such a way. And it is destroyed in such a way that it's just like the whole place just collapsed. We're not talking about like, oh, the place is in shambles. Everything is rubble. And there are only so many people in the world who could have done something like this. So they go and split up and try to find the person who did it. They come across someone at a construction site that certainly has the size and the strength of someone who could destroy a building. We know because we watch him do it. There's a building that needs to come down. The construction workers are all angry that they've gone and gotten this guy who appears to be Russian. He goes into the building, comes out of it after he, he also turns it into rubble. So,
Yeah,
it looks like we know who who did it. We just don't know why. And the interesting thing is this character is so polite toward everyone and doesn't understand why the workers are mad at him and calling him a Russian scab.
We've got to break this down a little bit because there's a lot of xenophobic language coming up. They call him, you're right, they call him a scab. They call him a foreign guy. Of course, it's Saturday morning cartoon, but these are, I think these are meant to be slurs against this heavily accented laborer who comes in and is able to fulfill this job and has this particular skill.
Yeah.
Yes, he's a mutant, and it's clear he's a mutant. His skill, though, is his superpower is superhuman strength. He's just beyond.
Well, that's simplifying it a little, because otherwise you think of him as sort of a Goliath character, but really he has the ability to make himself larger and made of metal. He is right. He becomes a metal man.
So his mutant phenotype is it's like an armored body, and he's able to size up. So my question for you, is this a shapeshifter?
Is it a shapeshifter? No.
Why not? Why isn't he classified under a shapeshifter?
Simply because he can sort of make himself bigger and metal?
Well,
wouldn't a shapeshifter... Traditionally, a shapeshifter would be able to shift their shape into anything. He just becomes a little bigger and his skin becomes an impenetrable metal.
The reason I ask is that when he's Ivan...
Peter.
Why do they call him Ivan?
Because he's Russian.
They called him Ivan. I thought his name was Ivan.
No.
Okay. So, Peter... So, when he is not Colossus, he has two forms.
By the way, he's always Colossus.
Okay, so
it's not like Shazam. Like he's not a little boy who then becomes Captain Marvel. He's always Peter Rasputin. He's always Peter. He's always Colossus.
Right. It's like
he's just like any other mutant who needs to like
Logan is always Wolverine. Wolverine is always Logan.
But if you think of it in the same way that Logan pops his claws,
sure.
Well, the claws are always there. They're just not always visible.
So where does the metal go? There. It's just under his skin, so he sort of pops out metal armor. What's the biological process?
We'll say that.
Okay. So the reason I think I'd like to call him a shapeshifter is that he can actually shift and transform into a passable non-mutant person who I'm calling Ivan, who's called Peter, and he can go about his day as Peter.
But wait a minute. Logan is a passable non-mutant character. Is he also a shapeshifter?
No.
Is Jean Grey a shapeshifter because she's a passable non-mutant?
No. It's that Colossus has two forms, and the two forms look nothing like each other.
They look exactly like each other, just one of them's made of metal. He's even got the flat top, but the flat top is also metal. It's so let me explain.
Okay.
So Peter Rasputin, otherwise known as Colossus, by the way, created by our late dear friend Len Wein, was created in 1975 for the original giant-sized X-Men #1. That's the one that you refer to occasionally. Yeah. And this was a character who witnessed the tragic death of his brother, and then that trauma triggered his pubescent mutant, ability. And that was, he becomes super strong. His body becomes an impenetrable metal. And some people are afraid of that. They can't do anything to him. and he's stronger than most everyone else. So that is his backstory. He is also maybe one of, if not the most polite character and most sort of empathetic and sympathetic characters in the Marvel universe. I think there's a reason why they have selected Colossus to play major roles in things like Deadpool, because he is such the antithesis of Deadpool. He doesn't use bad language. He's always super polite. He doesn't want to fight you unless, he has to restrain you in some way. He's just like a super nice dude.
And he shows that in this episode where he's somewhat already protective. Jubilee has a building crashing around her, and he at one point she's trying to fight him because she doesn't know whether he's responsible for the mansion being destroyed. He's kind of their first suspect.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to fight her, so he tries to actually protect her. He puts her in a tractor and has, forms metal around her so that she's safe but not attacking him.
Right.
Because he doesn't want to hurt her.
Right.
There's another point where I think it's Rogue that he saves as she's falling, which we'll get to, and he saves her. So there's this just genuine caring, protective nature.
But Wolverine gets on top of him and like a creepo starts sniffing him and realizes that he is not the scent of the character that he smelled in the ruins of the manor. So it can't be Peter / Colossus as the person who destroyed the manor. So in this particular case, he's a red herring. And I don't say red as if to, there is no pun intended that he is from Russia.
But I do want to note that I said this before, that the story around him and us being introduced to him, this is the first time he's appearing in the animated series.
Yeah.
He is being bullied and ostracized for being a foreigner.
Yeah.
And he's so
not even for being a mutant yet.
No,
because they suspect he might be a mutant simply because he's big and strong, but they haven't seen his metal skin yet. They are literally bullying him because he is Russian.
Right. And then they realize he's also a mutant. There's this double jeopardy about his character in particular, having two identities, both which I would say are external or are identifiable. They're what we might call like salient identities for a person. And for him, it's being both a mutant and being an immigrant, despite his good intentions to help these other laborers at this construction site.
Yeah.
He is seen as othered. He's basically feared. There's some sense of concern and worry and fear about his potential, that he could be dangerous, that he's unpredictable.
Well, and they refer to him as a scab too, which would imply that these guys have decided not to tear down the building because they are on strike.
Okay.
Perhaps, and because this guy has crossed their picket line, but none of them are carrying signs, and none of them are. I guess maybe it's simply because he's not in the union at all.
I would somewhat disagree and agree in what you're saying. I don't think they're on strike. I think they called him that because he's not on their team and he's coming in.
Right. That's
and
what I mean. It's like
doing the
he's
job.
not part of the union. So, you got a non-union guy to come in and like destroy the building. We wanted to destroy the building. And then Peter is like, come on, guys, why don't we all just work together? Come on, let's do this. And they're like, no, get out of here. And then that's when Logan like jumps on his back. He jumps on his back twice. Like it's in fact, Logan jumps on two people's backs throughout this episode. That's his move.
You know why? Because Logan is a short guy, and I know who you're about to talk about. These two characters are massive.
Are large.
He has to like catapult himself onto their backs and then slice their heads, and he's unsuccessful, I think, both times. But yes, I mean, we'll hopefully be able to talk more about Colossus because Colossus is such a lovable character.
Yeah, but unfortunately, he doesn't have a whole lot more in this particular episode. He is basically in the episode simply to give us a red herring, to introduce us to someone that it couldn't be. Because even at the end of the episode, they grant him access to the newly built X Manor, which actually he's the one building. And they're like, look, Charles isn't here, but clearly you're welcome anytime you want. And he thanks them and then says that he's going to do two things. He's going to go look for his sister and he's going to explore the rest of the United States. He just wants to see the sights for a little bit.
It's clear he hasn't been in the U.S. that long.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's the whole point of introducing him. Once you've met a mutant, that doesn't mean you've met them all. This is a mutant introducing new characteristics and lived experiences and different qualities around his identity that is now made more complex with him being a new immigrant and navigating what it's like to be a mutant and an immigrant in the U.S. And already fielding these othering types of assumptions and questions about, let me just say, like his validity, his whether he has papers, sort of this idea of like, hey, how are you, not much appreciation for his skills and more questioning whether he belongs there, if that makes sense.
Right. And I think what I appreciate about the way that they handled this character too, we open up the episode with a beautiful building that has been turned to rubble. The next building we see is turned to rubble. And then finally at the end, he's the one rebuilding the building. So he's not simply a destructive force like, say, the other character we are introduced to, the Juggernaut, for whom this episode is named. Juggernaut is going around the city doing the same thing. He is breaking into banks, stealing cash, destroying the buildings themselves. And you think it's a simple bank robbery type job. Like this is sort of a Rhino type job. But he reveals later in a conversation that he is having with the X-Men that really this was just a ploy to get Charles to come out of hiding and meet up with him. Like, I don't even think he cared about the cash.
No, he's trying to get his attention.
Yeah.
But tell us about the unstoppable Juggernaut.
The unstoppable
What is
Juggernaut.
up with this
because he does mention a couple of things that are key points to his story. For starters, he makes reference to his brother.
Yeah.
His brother is Charles Xavier. It's his half brother, actually. Juggernaut his name is Cain Marco, and Cain's father married Charles's mother after his father passed. And Cain was the target of incredible abuse and bullying by his own father. His father strongly preferred his new stepson, Charles, to his biological son, Cain. And Juggernaut makes reference to that regularly throughout this episode. There's a moment where Rogue tries to tap into him and take his mutant abilities away and just sort of take a significant amount of his strength away too. And Marco makes a reference to, you're being stupid. You're trying to take away mutant abilities that don't exist. I'm not a mutant.
So help me work through this. He says he has magic.
He has magic. Yes.
He refers to his abilities. And let me just make sure I understand his abilities. The Juggernaut is a big, bulky, beastly guy. Like probably, he's actually bigger than Colossus. He's pretty big.
Oh, he's gigantic. Yes.
And he is so he has actual armor, and he tells them that he's magical. He's not a mutant. He denies any mutant association. He looks at his powers as his magic.
Yes.
Is there a reason for that distinction?
And if I'm not mistaken, and I could be, but as we've been watching X-Men 92, 93, this is the first character we have come across, right, that is not a mutant, but has special human abilities.
For sure,
right?
because
like everyone else are mutants.
Yeah, and I still think he's a mutant.
So Kane is not a mutant. If you go back to the original origin of the character, and this dates back to the 60s, because he was introduced pretty early on in the X-Men comics. It's revealed in a pretty cool issue of the comic, actually, because Xavier is basically narrating the backstory of his half-brother. After a significant amount of abuse and bullying by his father, Kane ends up going overseas. I think it's Korea at the time. And he goes into a temple. And in this temple, he finds a red gem, a ruby. And he touches it and reads from it. And it's basically like Excalibur, right? He reads the inscription on the ruby, which then gives him magical powers. The magical powers once belonged to I want to say a demon named Cyttorak, and those powers are within this ruby. The ruby now has infused itself onto Kane. Kane gains massive strength and size. He basically becomes impenetrable. He has extreme stamina and endurance. And in fact, he has an unstoppable momentum. So in other words, if Juggernaut decides to run toward you, nothing's going to stop it. There is no, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
He doesn't tire out.
He does not tire, and he will simply move through whatever wall is in front of him. His helmet, and that's why Wolverine always goes, it's a pretty typical move. Wolverine always goes to take the helmet off, because the helmet actually protects him from any sort of psychic ability,
sure.
Similar to Magneto's helmet when you're talking about Charles and Magneto. And so his helmet is usually sort of magically fused to the suit. It's nearly impossible to remove, although Wolverine tends to regularly get it off. Anytime anybody needs to put Juggernaut down, it's usually Wolverine using the claws to take the helmet off.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because no unearned power goes unrewarded or unpunished.
Right.
So how is this character I'm noticing that he has a bit of a grievance, I'd say.
Against Charles.
Yes.
And really it's I'm not the psychologist. I don't want to get out of my lane here, but
get in the lane.
One could say that he's projecting his grievance onto Charles when actually it's his father that he hates more than anything. Charles was seen as the perfect son, and so Juggernaut has a significant amount of jealousy and anger pent up around that. And you hear it. I actually have a clip here. This is when Rogue attempts to weaken him by simply touching him, and Juggernaut kind of laughs her off and says, "You're about to find out what happens when you try to tap into me." And sure enough, she then almost becomes possessed in some way by Kane. Let's take a listen to this audio here.
And I think little Miss Cornpone is getting a taste of what it's like to try to absorb my powers.
Charles, you had it easy. You are the good one. but now I'm the strongest, and I will destroy you and your pathetic X-Men! Agony, evil thoughts. They love my brother, not me. They love my brother. Must destroy.
So when you listen to that audio, Drea, what do you take from that? This sounds to me like that classic case of the sibling who is ignored or mistreated while the other is seen as the golden child. And there's a crap ton of resentment that comes with that feeling.
There's a bit of transference of that hang up.
Yeah.
And that sense of not being good enough.
Yeah.
And then it being projected onto some feelings or the relationship with the brother. That's what you're saying.
Correct.
So what's interesting too is that Rogue not only absorbs Juggernaut's power, or rather, as she's absorbing his power, which ostensibly should be in the form of strength, in the form of physical strength, she also is absorbing his psychic, more of like this psychological energy.
Yeah.
And that psychic energy is very powerful in that it's highly intense. It's emotional. It's almost at a point that she cannot tolerate it. She's
we hear it. Yeah, it nearly drives
mind.
her mad until Storm is able to calm her down.
It's interesting.
Let it go.
Yeah.
Let it go.
It's like a level. It's almost like a level of emotional intensity and distress that Rogue's not used to.
Now, what I'm interested in as it pertains to Rogue in this particular case, because we know if Rogue touches a human being, she could kill them because she's draining their power. If Rogue touches a mutant, she is draining their power and draining their power, their superpower, that she is for a period of time taking on their abilities. But when it comes to magical beings,
okay, so that's the difference then.
She seems to not have the same ability. In fact, it could do more damage to her than it would to him, because he doesn't get tired and he doesn't slow down. He simply says, "You're about to find out what happens if you try to take this away from me."
Right. She's right. Correct. She's not absorbing mutant powers. She's absorbing the magical energy from the gem.
And the gem seems to be protecting Kane. Like
interesting.
The crimson gem of Cyttorak is protecting its.
Is it on him? Is it inside his body? Where's the actual gem?
I can't remember how that all. It's been forever and a day since I've read the comics, and it's been a super long time since I've not seen him in that outfit. So I don't want to speak out of school. I'm not sure where the gem lives now, but
someone will tell us.
But that is, yes, please let us know.
Tell us, where is the crimson gem?
Yeah, of Cyttorak. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, tell me about that. Tell us about this brotherly resentment and hatred, and is it really just transference from a hatred that he has toward his biological father?
Well, based on what you shared with me, it's likely that Charles Xavier might be a safe target. I don't know much about the parents and the parent situation, but sometimes this happens in families. And I'm going to talk a little bit about abuse here. So a little bit of a content warning for folks who might be sensitive to the subject of child abuse. When one sibling of multiple siblings is the target of abuse and others are not, or there's a difference between abusive treatment, which I think I'm hearing you say between Charles Xavier and Kane.
Right.
Then sometimes there's a dynamic that forms between the siblings, and it's not always the same. The humans are complicated, and there isn't a formula. This is not a formulaic explanation. It's just what is clinically seen sometimes, is that because the parental figure holds a lot of power and is able to exert control and punishment, a lot of times the offspring can't lash out or really defend themselves with a parental figure. So sometimes they're working out their emotional responses amongst the siblings.
And that's what he does even as children. He becomes that bad son that bullies and
he's the older.
and beats on.
He's the older of the two, right?
I believe he's the younger of the two. Okay. I think he's Charles's younger half brother. I don't remember the ages. To me, I always envision Charles as being older but weaker. If that makes sense. Like,
okay,
just not a. Maybe it's the redhead part of. Because whenever Kane whenever Kane takes his helmet off, you always see that he's actually got like rusty red hair.
Yeah, he's in the series. He's a lighter redhead.
Yeah,
not as red as Jean Grey. So he's more of a he's more.
There's a very limited color palette on this show.
Trying to
Everyone's a
describe
redhead. Every person with brown hair actually has red
it's
hair.
all a spectrum of redheaded people.
It's weird.
Far too many. Like
Logan is in some way, shape, or form a redhead in this series, I'm sure.
But anyhow, as I was saying, there is a dynamic that plays out, and sometimes it unfolds because of jealousy, of lack of safety, a sense that maybe I can't defend myself with my parent, but I'll create hostility and tension with a sibling, and maybe I can defend myself against the sibling. So there are some things that manifest, that not always the same dynamic or the same styles of responses.
Yeah.
But something we sometimes see is that transference toward another sibling, like lashing out or being hostile towards the sibling, and maybe even villainizing that sibling. And that's why I asked about order, like who's older, who's younger, because sometimes there's a sense of like a thwarted responsibility. Like, why didn't you should have protected me. You should have taken care of me. Where were you when I was being victimized? Why didn't you protect me?
Yeah.
And of course, with youngsters and adolescents, those are unfair accusations in a household that involves hostility and abuse, but it's a very natural response to feel. Another reaction, and this is again, just to throw this in there to explain a variety of differences, sometimes the siblings become even closer because it's like, you're the only safe person in my household that does not abuse me. And so there's this enmeshment.
There are scenes in the series The Boys that show that, where Butcher, we see that in his past, his father was incredibly abusive toward his younger brother, and Butcher always did everything he could to protect his brother, even if that meant taking the blame for something or suddenly distracting the father, not because he was treated well, but because he knew he would take the beatings. And if he took the beatings, at least his little brother wasn't. So it's that protective nature, which is sort of the opposite of what we see here. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, as a psychologist, how do you combat something like this? I'm sure there are a couple of different things that could be happening, right? It could be a perception that isn't really true, that you love my half sibling more than you love me. And it could also be a true perception. Mm-hmm. You clearly love my half sibling more than you love me. How would one go about combating that if, say, the parent realized what was going on? You wouldn't suddenly take the affection away from Charles and flood Kane with it. What do you do to create balance and more of a a safer household.
Well, I'm glad you said safer household, because the first thing anyone would do is to establish safety. And that includes potential assessments by CPS and getting other family members involved who could potentially be more, I guess, the safer caretakers for these kids. So there's a lot in here that we have to look at in addition to just the children. Mm-hmm. Are the parental figures creating a safe environment? Is this a place where children are able to thrive?
Yeah.
Do we have any elements here that are concerning where this is not a safe environment and we would have to reestablish safety in some way? And sometimes that's reassigning a different caregiver and things like that. If we're looking at mostly emotional dynamics and there's physical safety and there's a willingness by the parent to be more soothing and manage their anger and manage their physical behavior, then certainly you would look at the motivations and the histories and some of the emotional antecedents to this kind of differential treatment. One thing that's actually really common is that the half sibling reminds that parent of an abusive partner who is no longer in the picture. Or even a partner who was completely loving but has passed away. And there might be something unresolved and grief centered around that particular kiddo. And then there's some different treatment toward them because of what emotions they trigger or bring up for that adult. So it's hard to sort of give you a generic answer in that there's all these different variables we have to look at to better understand the family dynamic. Or I guess it's better said, who is safe in the household? Do we need to reestablish safety? And are the adults have most of the responsibility. Are the adults in this household willing to seek some kind of behavioral change and supervision so that they can aim toward more safe outcomes and healthy outcomes for the kids. And then for the kids, there's some dynamics there that could also be worked with around the transference of these emotions and hostility or tension amongst the siblings. Here we have an extra dynamic of one is a mutant and one has magic. When does Cain get his magic? Is he a kid?
No, he's an adult.
Oh.
He's in the military.
He's in the military when he gets his magic.
Yeah.
So this kid doesn't have these extra powers.
Right.
Charles Xavier, I assume, gets his powers around 12,
Puberty.
13, 14.
Yep.
And he's becoming more and more intuitive and brilliant.
He was already intelligent and brilliant.
He's good with relationships. He's the A student. He's studious. Of course Cain is going to feel a sense of resentment.
Yeah.
Where are his gifts? Where are his abilities? Who's going to be praising and valuing the parts of him that are good?
Oh, that's interesting. I just thought about this. Not to take you off this path, but it's the... You know how we talk about the fact that these episodes always have sort of a subplot that is also saying something about the A plot as well?
Yeah, for sure.
So the sister that Peter refers to, her name is Ileana Rasputin. People who know the New Mutants would know her as Magic. I'm not clear on what he's talking about when he says that he's trying to find her. It sort of suggests there was a storyline in which she was held hostage because a villain, was imprisoned. Villain Arcade was prisoned, and then that guy's assistant or someone close to him. It was she then had a bunch of people kidnapped and held hostage and basically ransomed them for Arcade's release from prison. And the X-Men had to go and break him out so that Ilyana, Rasputin, and all the other hostages could be set free. So it's very possible that he's referring to that. I have no idea what it would be if it wasn't that. And I'm curious to see if the next time we see Colossus down the road, he's found his sister, or if it's dropped altogether, or if he's still looking and it becomes like a major plot. But interestingly, Ilyana was that younger sister who was like, I don't understand. Where are my powers? When do I get to have powers?
Oh, okay.
After Colossus got his. And she would later get her abilities. But you look at the kindness of Colossus and the love that he clearly has for his younger sister. And then you look at Xavier having gotten powers before Kane did, and even Kane's was unnaturally acquired. And so you just look at these two, sets of siblings and how different they are from one another. Equally large, equally destructive, two very different personalities and relationships with their own family.
And different worldviews, because it seems like the unstoppable Juggernaut is very driven by destruction and power. And
I think he's also just one of those people who just rages out.
Sure.
Like he makes the comment about how he knocked on Charles's door, but he didn't think he was home.
So he destroys the mansion?
So he destroys the building.
Or does he mean by knocking, he just thrust his body into the mansion? And that's...
I think it's a little of all of it. I think, but based on Juggernaut, you always get a sense that he was probably teasing him, like, "Hey, Charles, it's your old brother. He's coming. Oh, I banged the door down. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Let me try to help. Oh, I just expanded your walls. Oh, let me do this." And he probably then just started, destroying the building looking for Charles. And then when he couldn't find him, left and decided to lure him out by robbing banks. The more that you talk about the unstoppable Juggernaut, the more I actually start to feel kind of sorry for him, that he's coming from a place of lacking the things that his brother was gifted, including the mutant powers, but also some other elements. And now look at his brother, a professor leading a community of people, doing all of this social good, ostensibly being this like celebrity figure in terms of like mutant communities. And Kane is kind of this like bulky guy who's not achieved so far, from what I can tell, not achieved a lot of those things that are valuable in society. And here he is seeking vengeance, or seeking something to correct the thing, whatever created the sense of being wronged. Right. So he has this grievance, but I think, of course, his name as well. I mean, I don't think it's any accident that he is named after Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that he's named after him, but he certainly shares the same first name as the most famous Cain in literature. But it is, for an episode that is primarily a cat and mouse, not terribly deep. By the end of it, we're now really getting some good meat on these characters. I just have to say, though, we always talk about destruction and how Superman would never destroy all those buildings in Metropolis while fighting Zod, and would never, these people would never do this, and this is the sign of a hero. Storm uproots a building from its foundation and crushes Juggernaut with it. We don't know if there were people in that building when she did that. we don't know if there are people supposed to be in that building tomorrow. Like maybe it's a Sunday and people are like, oh, I can't wait to go to work tomorrow. And they show up and their building is in the middle of the street in rubble because she used it to crush a big red suited Goliath.
Well, we are arguing something that the Superhuman Registration Act and the Mutant Registration Act would,
like, now I'm on their side.
be-
Now I'm realizing,
support.
hey, maybe don't pick up buildings and use
So
them as weapons.
This comes up a lot actually in X-Men 97, and here's where we're going to wrap, is full circle back to 97, is that some humans and some mutants do feel like they need to keep the peace better. They need to calm it down. They need to, for lack of better phrasing, act more like people, act more like humans, act more like non-mutants, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If you act more like non-mutants, you will not get into this kind of trouble, right? So, but what does that mean? Muting your powers, muting your identity, self-erasure, you get into the slippery slope of, but how, when I'm doing the work of protecting other people, when I'm doing the work of an X-Men in particular, where it is your duty to protect and to ensure that villains like the unstoppable Juggernaut are not further destroying the society or destroying the city. And so it gets into that gray
literally
area.
just did what he did and what Colossus did
She did.
on a building that wasn't even scheduled to be demolished. Like yeah. She's not one of those people who feels like they should tamp it down. She's not one of them.
She's not. And I'm still, as you can tell, I still position myself in feeling uncertain whether they should tone it down.
Yeah.
And again, she had to do that to capture him.
Except
it
didn't work.
Everybody, almost pretty much. Jean Grey was the only person who succeeded. Everyone pretty much failed, from Rogue to Wolverine to Storm. They could not get this guy to calm down. They could not control him.
Yeah.
So they really needed to exert force and to use all of their powers to try to best him.
By the way, something that you may not know, little history on Juggernaut. Jack Kirby once said that the character was based on, and forgive me, I'm not going to pretend to be able to necessarily pronounce this word correctly. It is the name of a Hindu deity by the name of Juggernaut.
Okay.
And basically that deity, the worshipers would allow themselves, actually, let me read this, whose worshipers threw themselves on the ground and allowed themselves to be crushed by the idol of Juggernaut as it was wheeled forward on a tower 60 feet high. So these worshipers would just lay down and allow themselves to be crushed by the unstoppable Juggernaut. And Kirby and Stan Lee were like, yeah, we're going to base this character, just this unstoppable beast-like character. He's not like Beast at all, but that's not what I meant. On this Hindu deity. And so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Speaking of Beast is still in prison. I just want to
But we got to see him. We got to see him. And
did we?
We did.
Was he in the prison hold on. So they released, Storm and Rogue went to a prison to release Peter.
Yeah.
Was Beast in there too?
What? Did you get up and walk away?
I must have blinked.
There's an entire scene during the breakout. Peter even takes the same stance as Beast and says, no, I can't go. And then Beast speaks to him in Russian and says, trust my friends. go prove your innocence. And he's like, okay, I am going to go. Let's go now. And Beast is there reading still. And he says,
oh my goodness.
He was like, hey, because they even say, hey, do you want in on the jailbreak? And he's
No,
like,
he does not.
no, thanks. I am here. But please come back during regular visiting hours, and says, and thank Gene for the cookies. So they do come and visit him, and Gene brings him treats, cookies. I can't believe you missed that.
This seems like a long scene for me to miss. I must have been writing notes.
It was a pretty decently paced scene, but he's like, yeah, he's just there. He's right across the hall.
Poor Beast. Well, so for folks catching up, Beast has been in prison since the first two episodes or so, for civil disobedience, and
for just destruction of property and all this other stuff. They really tried to throw the book at him.
They are using him as an example.
Yes.
So they've charged him.
And he is using himself as an example as well.
As he will. So they've charged him with all this criminal activity. He was, by association, he was a part of the group that was infiltrating a government building.
Yeah.
So he's been given some opportunities to break out or bypass the system, but he is very convinced. He sort of has this passive ideology right now. I'm going to trust the system, and I'm going to do my time.
And even if he doesn't trust the system, he is allowing himself to basically be a martyr and to show the world how his kind is treated, whether it's fairly or unfairly. He wants to make sure the rest of the world sees. Okay, so I can't wait to see the next episode to see where some of this goes. I have a feeling we're not going to see Peter because he's basically off sightseeing and looking for his sister, Ileana. But until then, I want to thank some of our patrons who have helped make this episode possible. We have Aaron Wenrick, Mike Ficklin, Dr. Jerome Anderson, Antonio Lopez, Kevin Ortel, Todd Stashwick, Hero's Journey Fitness, Trevor Schwartz, Mark Pepper, Swara Sali, Frank Moeller, Rachel Acevedo Hoffman, and of course my father, Carl Ward. Thank you all for your participation in our Patreon. You can get your name called out by joining patreon.com/Arkham Sessions, joining the $5 tier. That will get your name shouted out on the next episode of the podcast. Until that next episode, Drea, why don't you tell the good folks where they can find you online?
You can find me on my website, drdreapsychology.com, and on social media, Dr. Drea Psychology. Check out our Discord. We would love for you to join. It's free. You can find it on the Instagram bio. This is for the Arkham Sessions Instagram. And a shout out to all my Arkham residents in our Discord server.
Awesome. You can find me online. I am mostly over on Instagram at B_Ward028. You can also find us both at the Arkham Sessions on Instagram. Come follow us on Facebook. You can find us in any number of other platforms, as Drea mentioned, Discord. Also, I want to give a shout out to David Nett and Todd Stashwick, who have launched or about to launch their own project that I am a part of, and I am so grateful to be a part of it. I highly recommend you go check out progcorefantasy.com and see what that is all about. If you are a lover of role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons especially, but really any kind of game along those lines, you may be very interested to see what they have to say. So go check them out, progcorefantasy.com. Until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.